A policeman took the Epipen from the girl during her allergy attack. Upon hearing who her father was at a loss for words, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments. The sun bathed the park in warm, golden light, glinting off the swinging playground equipment and casting long shadows across the lush green lawns. The gentle sway of the cherry blossom trees dotted around the area lent a picturesque charm, their pink and white petals falling like confetti in the slight breeze. The park buzzed with life, filled with the sound of children's laughter, the distant calls of vendors selling ice cream, and the cheerful jingling of bicycle bells as children and adults alike cycled down the winding paths. This was a sanctuary for families, a place for joy and respite, and 10-year-old Amira absorbed it all with bright, eager eyes. Amira ran along the open field with her friends, her curls bouncing as she raced to keep up. Her laugh echoed across the lawn as she chased after her friend Layla, both of them occasionally tumbling down in giggles, only to get back up and start again. For Amira, moments like these were precious, filled with a joy unburdened by responsibility or care, a fleeting freedom that seemed boundless. Yet, even amid her laughter, a small, unobtrusive reminder of her limitations weighed down her backpack. Her Epipen. It was a necessity, something she could never be without, and though it was small, it carried with it a reality she couldn't ignore. Her father, Captain Yusuf, sat a little distance away, his watchful eyes following her every move. Though he was dressed casually in a dark shirt and jeans, the quiet intensity in his gaze betrayed his profession. As a captain in the local police force, Yusuf had seen the world's harsher side, a fact that left him in a constant state of vigilance. In public, his daughter's laughter filled him with pride and a sense of responsibility that went beyond his badge and rank. But the same job that made him strong also left him with an underlying worry, a fear that sometimes he could not protect her from the invisible threats in her life. For now, however, Yusuf allowed himself a brief smile as he watched her. He could see Amira's determination to keep up with her friends, the way she pushed through her limitations. She didn't want anyone to know she had to be careful, that her life was sometimes dictated by an allergy that made the smallest slip a dangerous affair. Every time she fell, he watched her glance at the small, innocent backpack, reassured by the presence of her life-saving device. He admired her spirit, her resilience, but his heart ached knowing that her freedom would always have strings attached. Amira noticed her father watching her and waved enthusiastically. She adored him, viewing him as her hero, the one who kept everyone safe. But more than anything, she wanted his approval and to make him proud. She loved hearing his stories about courage and justice, about standing up for the weak and defending what was right. Sometimes she fantasized about being a police officer herself, someone who could protect others just like her father did. But there was always a lingering voice in her mind, reminding her of her limitations, grounding her in reality. As she and Layla caught their breath, Layla, a petite girl with a quick smile and mischievous glint in her eye, turned to Amira. "What do you think we'll be when we grow up?" Amira thought for a moment. "Maybe I'll be like my dad," she said with a hopeful smile. "Someone who helps people." Layla grinned. "That's perfect for you, but I don't know if I'd be brave enough. Maybe I'll just have a shop, or maybe I'll travel the world." Amira's eyes sparkled at the thought. Travel. The idea of going to places without the fear of allergies holding her back, of living a life where she could eat and explore freely. These were the dreams she held close. She wanted adventure, but adventure felt as distant as the clouds in the sky. She laughed, nodding along with Layla, but her heart was quietly, stubbornly dreaming of a life without limits. The afternoon passed in laughter, shared secrets, and dreams whispered among friends, interrupted only by brief reminders of her reality. She felt a faint itch on her wrist, probably from some pollen. She brushed it off as if it were nothing, unwilling to let her mind wander to the possibility of a reaction. Yet, as the day progressed, her focus kept coming back to her backpack, to the Epipen that held her between safety and danger. It was like an invisible shadow over her carefree moments, a nagging presence that wouldn't let her forget. At times, Layla would grow quiet, a shadow crossing her face when no one else was watching. Amira noticed but didn't push her friend to talk, sensing there was something Layla kept hidden. They both had secrets, silent burdens that seemed too heavy for their young shoulders but felt easier to carry in each other's company. Layla was her confidant, the one friend she could share her dreams and fears with, even the ones that were hard to voice. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Yusuf called Amira over. She ran up to him, still flushed from play, and flopped down on the bench beside him, breathing hard but grinning widely. He looked down at her, feeling a swell of love and pride, but also that quiet, unspoken worry. "Did you have fun today, little officer?" he asked, ruffling her hair. She swatted his hand away, laughing. "Yes, a lot of fun," she exclaimed, her voice bright. "But Layla said she's going to travel the world. I think I want to help people like you do." Yusuf's heart skipped a beat. He had always known Amira looked up to him, but hearing her say it filled him with a mix of joy and dread. He wanted her to dream big, but he also knew the world wasn't always kind. He wanted to protect her from the harsh realities he faced every day. "That's a noble dream, Amira," he said gently. "But always remember, no matter what you choose, you need to look after yourself too. You know why you carry your backpack with you, right?" Amira nodded, her expression turning serious. "Because of my allergy. Because if something happens, I need the Epipen." "That's right," Yusuf said, his tone firm but warm. "And that's part of being brave, too, knowing when to take care of yourself." Amira listened carefully, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he wasn't just talking about her allergy, but about life in general. She sensed his concern and the love behind it, and it made her want to be strong, to face the world with courage, even if it meant carrying her backpack a little heavier than others. As they walked home together, the park gradually emptying behind them, Amira felt a renewed determination. She would be brave, just like her father. And maybe one day she would find a way to balance her dreams with the reality she carried, a reality wrapped in a small, life-saving device. The next afternoon in the park was just as lively. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm shades of amber across the playground, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. Amira and her friends, as usual, had gathered near the old swings, their laughter echoing through the warm autumn air. They chased one another, threw handfuls of leaves, and fell into piles of laughter on the ground. For Amira, it felt like nothing could break this perfect moment. But sometimes danger slips in when you least expect it. Amira was chasing Layla, her feet kicking up a flurry of leaves when she tripped, barely catching herself on the ground. She laughed it off, her gaze turning to her friends. Layla was snacking on something from a small bag, a nutty, sweet snack her parents had packed, harmless in appearance but a silent threat to Amira. Without thinking, she pushed herself up, brushed off her hands, and went right back to chasing her friends. Moments later, she felt a strange prickling sensation in her throat, almost like she'd accidentally inhaled a speck of dust. She coughed softly, trying to shake it off, but the prickling didn't go away. It only worsened, spreading down to her chest in an uncomfortable tightness. Her breath began to hitch, and her vision swayed as she realized what was happening. An allergic reaction. Fear shot through her. Her body started to tremble as she remembered her father's words. "Always keep the Epipen with you." She fumbled with her backpack, her hands shaken as she tried to open the zipper. Each second felt like an eternity as her vision started to blur, her breathing becoming harder and harder. Nearby, a police officer was making his rounds, his attention caught by the scene of Amira struggling on the ground, clutching at her backpack. To him, it looked as if a child was either in some kind of distress or worse. Unfamiliar with her, he approached her cautiously, his voice firm. "Hey, you there," he called out. Amira barely registered his presence as her fingers clumsily fought to retrieve the EpiPen. She knew that if she didn't administer it soon, the reaction would get worse, but her panic made her hands feel like they were moving in slow motion. The officer, seeing her desperation, assumed she was attempting something dangerous. He moved quickly, his tone sharp. "Put that down. Let me see what you have." His sudden, commanding presence only added to her anxiety. "Please," she tried to say, her voice faint as she gasped for air. "It's my medicine." But the officer misinterpreted her slurred, struggling words. Without hesitation, he reached for the backpack, his hands closing over hers as he pulled the EpiPen out of her grasp, his grip firm. Amira's heart raced in pure panic. The one thing she needed, the one thing standing between her and complete disaster, had just been taken away from her. "Give it back," she tried to cry out, her voice no more than a whisper. Her breaths came in shallow gasps now, and her vision began to fade. She felt her body weakening, the world around her blurring into indistinct shapes and sounds. Her throat was closing up, her limbs felt like they were made of lead, and she was helpless to fight back. The officer's brow furrowed as he finally registered the severity of her condition. His misunderstanding was slowly dawning on him, but by then the damage had been done. Realizing his error, he fumbled to give her the EpiPen, his hands clumsy as he struggled with the unfamiliar device. He'd never handled one before, and his movements were frantic, each second ticking away with terrifying precision. Amira was barely conscious now, slipping in and out of awareness. Her thoughts were hazy, fear mixed with confusion, but somewhere in the back of her mind she remembered her father's lessons. With the last bit of strength she could muster, she moved her hand weakly, guiding his to the right position, hoping he'd understand. The officer's face was pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He followed her shaky direction, pressing the EpiPen into her thigh as he'd seen paramedics do before. For a split second, the world was still, holding its breath as the adrenaline began to surge through her system. The officer released the pen and knelt beside her, his hand hovering uncertainly as he watched her, regret etched deeply in his expression. Slowly, the tension in her chest began to ease. Her breathing became less labored, and color returned to her face. She lay there, weak and exhausted, but conscious, the immediate threat retreating. But the trauma remained, her body still shaking from the fear and adrenaline. She had come terrifyingly close to the edge, saved only by last-second intervention that should never have been necessary. The officer's expression softened as he realized the true weight of his actions. He had meant to help, but his assumptions had nearly cost her everything. Amira could feel the embarrassment and shame radiating from him. But she had no words, only a hollow feeling of vulnerability that lingered like a shadow. As her breathing steadied, memories flooded her mind. Moments with her father, his reassuring words as he taught her to use the Epipen, the countless times he'd warned her to be careful. She felt a pang of sadness, remembering how confident she'd felt, how sure she'd been that she could handle things on her own. Now, that confidence felt fractured, leaving her feeling smaller and more fragile than she had ever thought possible. By the time the ambulance arrived, Amira was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The paramedics moved swiftly, checking her vitals and asking the officer what had happened. He stammered through an explanation, his voice barely audible. The weight of his mistake hung heavily in the air, and though he tried to explain his perspective, it was clear he was struggling with the guilt. The ride to the hospital was quiet, filled only with the steady beeping of monitors and the low hum of the ambulance engine. Amira lay on the stretcher, her eyes closed, replaying the events over and over in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness, the terrifying moment when she'd realized her life was out of her control. It was a sobering, painful reminder that despite her dreams, there were things she couldn't change or control. As the ambulance pulled up to the hospital, Amira felt a deep weariness settle over her. The brave, adventurous dream she'd harbored seemed further away than ever, overshadowed by the memory of what had just happened. The encounter had shaken her to her core, leaving her with a mixture of fear and anger that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Inside the emergency room, doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency, their voices low and calm as they tended to her. Amira's mind drifted, caught in the fog of her thoughts, replaying the officer's sharp words, the moment he'd taken away her Epipen. She felt the sting of frustration and helplessness, knowing that this was her reality, one filled with rules and restrictions that others could not always understand. For the first time, she truly understood what her father had been trying to teach her. In a world that didn't always see or understand her condition, she had to be strong, vigilant, and ready. The weight of that truth settled over her, a heavy reminder that she could never let her guard down, not even in the safety of a park on a sunny afternoon. Amira lay motionless on the hospital bed, her small form surrounded by the sterile white walls of the intensive care unit. The quiet beeps of the monitors filled the room with a tense rhythm, each sound a reminder of how close she had come to disaster. She could still feel the residual tightness in her chest, the ghost of panic lingering in her body. Every breath felt deliberate, a fragile connection to the world she had almost lost. The room was dimly lit, with only a single lamp casting a soft glow. Around her were machines, large, intimidating, humming with life and purpose. Amira's gaze traced the tangle of tubes and wires that connected her to these machines, feeling small and vulnerable in the vast landscape of medical equipment. The bright, clean smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint, metallic tang of medicine. She'd never imagined herself here, in a place where her life was held together by tubes and needles, each one a link between her and survival. She heard hurried footsteps outside the door, a doctor's quiet instructions, the shuffle of a nurse moving quickly. Every sound seemed amplified, like a distorted symphony that kept her awake, reminding her of the fragility of her situation. She fought the drowsiness creeping over her, a side effect of the medicine, because closing her eyes meant reliving the terrifying incident over and over. The memory of it was vivid, her shaking hands, the officer's firm grip, and the sheer helplessness she'd felt. It replayed in her mind like a bad dream, but it wasn't a dream. It was a reality that had left her feeling powerless. For a moment, she had been a passenger in her own body, watching from a distance as her life slipped from her control. A wave of frustration washed over her, a feeling she didn't know how to express or handle. Why did things have to be this way? Why did she have to live with the constant threat of her own body betraying her? Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, her father, Yusuf, sat in the waiting room, his face pale and drawn. The moment he'd received the call, his heart had dropped, his mind filling with images of his daughter in pain, of her small form struggling to breathe. As a police officer, he was accustomed to handling crises, to keeping a steady hand in the face of danger. But this was different. This was his daughter, his little girl, lying somewhere beyond those closed doors, and he felt powerless to protect her. Yusuf clenched his fists, a storm of emotions swirling within him. Guilt, anger, and fear gnawed at him. He was torn between the demands of his duty and the love he held for his child. How had he let this happen? He had spent his life serving and protecting others, yet he hadn't been there when his daughter had needed him most. The nurse entered the waiting room, her expression professional but sympathetic. She had seen his type before, the stoic ones, the strong ones, who fell apart when it was their loved ones lying on the hospital bed. "Captain Yusuf," she called softly, her voice drawing him out of his thoughts. He looked up, a mixture of hope and dread in his eyes. "How is she?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She's stable for now," the nurse replied, her tone gentle. "The reaction was severe, but she's responding to the treatment. She'll need some time to recover, but she's a strong little girl." The words "strong little girl" echoed in his mind. Yes, she was strong, far stronger than he sometimes realized. She had faced her fears, lived with her limitations, and yet continued to dream and laugh, even when life threw obstacles in her way. He felt a pang of pride mixed with regret. She had inherited his resilience, but he hadn't been there to shield her from harm. As he rose to go to her room, he was stopped by the nurse's gentle hand on his arm. "Captain," she said softly, "there will be a police officer waiting to speak with you about what happened." His face hardened. He knew why they wanted to talk to him, and the thought filled him with a simmering anger. He was a police officer himself, yet his own daughter had suffered because of a mistake, a failure to understand. His mind raced as he prepared himself for the conversation, torn between his sense of duty and his feelings as a father. Inside the hospital room, Amira's eyes fluttered open, her gaze landing on her father as he stepped in. He took in the sight of her lying there, pale but alive, her dark eyes tired but steady. Without a word, he moved to her side, his hand gently brushing her hair away from her face. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of relief and sadness. "Baba," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. He held her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm here, Amira," he replied, his voice filled with a tenderness he rarely allowed himself to show. "I'm here now." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and emotions. For Yusuf, it was a moment of reckoning. He saw the weight of the world on his daughter's small shoulders, the burden of living with an invisible threat that others didn't understand. He had always tried to teach her strength, to prepare her for a world that wasn't always fair. But seeing her now, he realized that he had perhaps underestimated the depth of her struggle. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure entered. Amira's grandmother, her face lined with worry and love. She moved to Amira's side, wrapping her in a gentle embrace. "My brave girl," she murmured, her words filled with warmth and comfort. The presence of family filled the room, a quiet reminder of the strength that came from love and support. As the hours passed, Yusuf spoke with the doctors, his expression hardening as he listened to their explanations, their assurances that she would recover. His anger simmered beneath the surface, directed at the world, at the officer who had misjudged the situation, at himself. His mind raced with thoughts of what could have been, each what if a dagger in his heart. Finally, he couldn't hold it in any longer. Turning to the doctor, he asked, "How could this happen? Why wasn't she safe in a place as simple as a park?" The doctor, understanding the depth of his pain, offered a gentle explanation. "Unfortunately, Captain, not everyone understands the severity of allergic reactions. It's a hidden condition, and many people don't realize how life-threatening it can be. Your daughter was very brave, and she did everything she could, but sometimes it's a matter of awareness." The words weighed heavily on Yusuf. Awareness. His profession was built on awareness, on training, on understanding the dangers and risks. Yet his daughter had suffered because someone else lacked that understanding. A sense of purpose took root in him, an idea forming in his mind, but he pushed it aside for now, focusing on the present, on being there for Amira. When he returned to her side, he found her looking out the window, her eyes distant. She had always loved the outdoors, the feel of grass beneath her feet, the warmth of the sun on her face. But now, he saw a flicker of hesitation, a shadow of fear that hadn't been there before. Sitting down beside her, he took her hand once more. "Amira," he began softly, "I know this was scary, but you don't have to be afraid. You're strong, stronger than anyone I know." She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "Baba," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet resolve, "I don't want to feel different. I want to be like everyone else." Yusuf's heart broke a little at her words. He understood her desire to fit in, to live a life free from fear, but he also knew that her life would always be different, shaped by challenges that others might never understand. He struggled to find the right words to give her comfort without diminishing her reality. "You're like everyone else, Amira," he said gently, "but you're also unique, and that's a strength, not a weakness. What happened today doesn't make you any less brave or strong. You faced something difficult, and you came through it. That's courage." Her gaze softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Though she was still shaken, his words offered a glimmer of reassurance, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this struggle. As the night wore on, Amira drifted into a restless sleep, her father watching over her with a fierce protectiveness. The events of the day had left their mark, but he knew that they would find a way forward, that their bond would be strengthened by this shared pain. And as Yusuf sat by her bedside, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to ensure that no other child, no other family, would have to endure what they had. He would use his position, his experience, to raise awareness, to protect others from ignorance and fear. For now, though, he was simply a father, keeping watch over his daughter, his heart filled with both love and sorrow as he waited for her to heal. 2 days later, Amira was discharged from the hospital. Her recovery was slow, marked by moments of lingering fear and memories that resurfaced without warning. Yusuf had barely left her side, his presence a constant source of reassurance. He had watched over her, comforted her and quietly battled his own growing anger over what had happened. Beneath his calm exterior, he was a storm, a man driven by a single purpose: to find the officer who had taken her Epipen and demand answers. The day of the confrontation came on an unusually gray afternoon. The air was heavy, and a faint drizzle began to fall as Yusuf parked his car outside the precinct. He knew where the officer would be, a man named Officer Malik, who had joined the force only a few years ago. Malik's record was clean, but Yusuf's feelings had nothing to do with policy or procedure. They were personal, a father's pain disguised beneath the mask of a police captain. As Yusuf entered the precinct, heads turned. His colleagues knew him to be fair but fierce, and today his determined gaze warned them to keep their distance. With each step, his mind replayed the image of Amira lying in that hospital bed, her small form surrounded by machines and wires. Every beep of those monitors, every murmur of the doctors as they worked to save her, fueled his anger. He had witnessed the fragility of his daughter's life, and now he was ready to confront the man whose ignorance had nearly taken it from her. Officer Malik was in the common room, sipping coffee and talking with another officer. When he noticed Yusuf approaching, he fell silent, his expression shifting to a mix of surprise and unease. He had heard rumors that the captain wanted to speak with him, but the gravity of the situation seemed to dawn on him only now. Yusuf stopped in front of him, his gaze unwavering. "Officer Malik," he said, his voice low but steady, "I believe we need to talk." Malik swallowed, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. "Captain Yusuf," he began, forcing a respectful tone, I understand you might be upset. I didn't mean for things to go the way they did. I just—" "Upset?" Yusuf's voice was calm, but his words were laced with barely restrained anger. "Upset doesn't begin to cover it. Do you have any idea what you did? Do you know that your actions nearly cost my daughter her life?" Malik's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, searching for the right words, but all that came out was a feeble, I thought she was in trouble. I thought she was holding something dangerous." "Dangerous?" Yusuf's voice rose, filled with disbelief. "The only danger she faced was because of your ignorance. You took her Epipen, the one thing that could save her in an emergency, and you put her life at risk. Do you understand that?" A silence fell over the room as the other officers listened, their faces filled with a mixture of sympathy and tension. Malik's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to find the words to defend himself. "I didn't know," he whispered. I thought I was helping. She looked so, I don't know, desperate. I thought maybe she'd taken something, that she needed to be stopped before she hurt herself." Yusuf shook his head, his eyes filled with a cold disappointment. "You thought? But did you think to ask? Did you think to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the situation than what you assumed? Did you think to ask why a 10-year-old girl would be so desperate to hold on to a small device?" Malik's face flushed with shame, and he looked away. I just didn't know," he murmured again, his voice weak. "I didn't realize how serious it was." For a moment, Yusuf said nothing, his gaze hard and unyielding. He had seen this kind of ignorance before, the kind that led people to judge without understanding, to act without considering the consequences. But he had never imagined that such ignorance would touch his own family, that it would nearly take his daughter from him. "Let me tell you something, Officer Malik," he said finally, his voice steely. My daughter lives with this condition every single day. She carries that Epipen with her because she knows that a single mistake could end her life. She doesn't have the luxury of assumptions or second chances, and you took that from her. You stole her security, her safety, because you didn't think. Malik's shoulders slumped and he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Captain Yusuf. I truly am. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Yusuf took a deep breath, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to lash out, to demand justice for his daughter, but he knew that anger alone wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he focused on the lesson he had learned from this experience, a lesson that went beyond personal pain. Sorry isn't enough, Malik, he said quietly. It's not enough for Amira, and it's not enough for anyone else who lives with conditions that aren't immediately visible. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about understanding, about awareness. You can't just act on assumptions, not when lives are at stake. Malik nodded, his expression one of genuine remorse. I understand, sir. I'll make sure it never happens again. Yusuf's gaze softened, his anger tempered by the faintest flicker of empathy. He could see that Malik was truly sorry, that he hadn't acted out of malice, but out of ignorance. And while that didn't excuse his actions, it was a reminder of how far they all had to go, of the need for greater understanding. There's one thing you can do to make this right, Yusuf said finally, his tone firm. Educate yourself. Learn about conditions like my daughter's. And if you encounter someone else in a similar situation, don't act out of fear or assumption. Act with compassion. Ask questions. Because ignorance is no excuse, not when lives are at stake. Malik nodded, his expression filled with a determination that hadn't been there before. I will, Captain, I promise. With a final nod, Yusuf turned and walked away, leaving Malik standing there, a man changed by the weight of his actions. As Yusuf stepped outside, the drizzle had turned into a full rain, the sky gray and heavy. But in his heart, he felt a flicker of hope, a hope that perhaps through his actions he could make a difference, that he could protect others from the pain his family had endured. Returning to his car, Yusuf thought about the lessons he had learned, the strength he had seen in his daughter, and the resilience she had shown in the face of fear. He knew he couldn't shield her from every danger, but he could fight to make the world a little safer, a little kinder, for her and for others like her. As he drove away from the precinct, his thoughts shifted to the next step. This was more than just a personal battle. It was a call to action. He would share Amira's story, raise awareness, and push for change in his community. If ignorance had nearly taken his daughter from him, then he would ensure that knowledge and compassion would protect others from the same fate. The following weeks were marked by tension and reflection. News of the incident had quietly spread through the community, sparking conversations and debates about awareness and empathy, especially for those living with invisible conditions. Yusuf's anger had subsided into a steely determination, a desire to not only protect his daughter, but to bring about change. He reached out to various organizations, raising awareness and speaking about the importance of understanding and compassion. But as his work gained traction, a new chapter was unfolding, one that would force him to confront the complexities of human nature. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the station, he saw Officer Malik standing in the hallway waiting for him. The young officer's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by a weariness that Yusuf recognized as guilt. There was something different in his stance, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. With a sigh, Yusuf gestured for him to follow, leading him to an empty meeting room. Malik took a seat, his hands clenched in his lap, his gaze fixed on the table. After a few moments of silence, he began to speak, his voice quiet but steady. "Captain, I want you to know that I've been thinking about what you said. I know that my actions, they could have cost your daughter her life. I can't stop thinking about it." Yusuf regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could sense the sincerity in Malik's words, the weight of his remorse. This wasn't just an apology. It was a man wrestling with his own actions, a struggle that Yusuf understood all too well. He had spent years in the force, facing his own moral battles, and he knew how difficult it could be to come to terms with mistakes. "Go on," Yusuf said, his voice calm but encouraging. Malik took a deep breath. "The truth is, I grew up in a neighborhood where people didn't trust each other. I was raised to think that everyone was hiding something, that danger was always around the corner. That fear, it became a part of me. I wanted to help, to protect people, but I didn't realize that sometimes my own fears clouded my judgment. I saw your daughter struggling, and I didn't see a child who needed help. I saw a potential threat." Yusuf listened, his expression softening as he realized the depth of Malik's struggle. He could see that Malik's actions weren't born out of malice, but from a place of fear, a fear that had shaped him from a young age. It was a fear Yusuf had encountered many times before, in himself and in others. But he also knew that fear couldn't be an excuse. It had to be faced, challenged, and ultimately overcome. "You know," Yusuf said quietly, "fear is a powerful thing. It can protect us, but it can also blind us. What happened with my daughter, it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, not just in our actions, but in our understanding of others. I don't hold a grudge against you, Malik, but I do expect you to learn from this, to grow from it." Malik nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and determination. "I want to change, Captain. I want to be the kind of officer who acts with empathy, who doesn't let fear control his actions. I've started attending workshops, learning about conditions like your daughter's. I want to understand, to be better." Yusuf felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps this experience had planted a seed of growth within Malik. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but the fact that Malik was willing to face his own fears, to challenge his assumptions, was a step in the right direction. "There's something else I wanted to say," Malik added, his voice barely more than a whisper. "When I was a kid, my brother, he had an accident. He was injured badly, and the people around us didn't know how to help. They didn't understand his condition, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. I think that's why I reacted the way I did with Amira. I was trying to protect, but I didn't realize I was projecting my own fears onto her." Yusuf's expression softened as he listened. The story added a new layer to his understanding of Malik, a glimpse into the pain that had shaped him. He could see the parallels, the way trauma had left its mark on Malik, just as it had on himself. They were both men shaped by loss, by the desire to protect, but the paths they had taken were different. "It's not easy, Malik," Yusuf said gently. "We carry our pasts with us, our fears, our pain, but we also have the power to choose how we respond. You can let your past define you, or you can learn from it. Use it to help others instead of holding them back." Malik nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I understand, Captain. I'll do better. I promise." A silence fell between them, filled with a sense of mutual understanding, a shared respect that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Yusuf felt a sense of closure, a release of the anger and resentment he had carried since the incident. He realized that Malik, like everyone else, was a product of his experiences, his choices shaped by both strength and vulnerability. They parted ways with a handshake, a simple gesture that held the weight of forgiveness and reconciliation. As Yusuf watched Malik leave, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had confronted his anger, faced the man who had nearly taken his daughter from him, and, in the process, he had found a new perspective. This wasn't just about protecting his daughter. It was about building a world where understanding and compassion could flourish. The next day, Yusuf took Amira to her follow-up appointment at the hospital. She was still a bit fragile, but her spirit was unbroken. As they walked through the bustling hallways, she clung to his hand, her small fingers wrapped around his in a silent expression of trust. Yusuf felt a pang of pride as he looked down at her, reminded of her resilience, her bravery. After her appointment, they sat together in a quiet corner of the hospital, watching the people pass by. Yusuf took a deep breath, deciding it was time to talk to her about what had happened, to help her understand the complexities of the world they lived in. "Amira," he began softly, "do you remember the officer from the park?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She nodded slowly, a shadow of fear crossing her face as she remembered the incident. "Sometimes," Yusuf continued gently, "people don't understand things they can't see. That officer, he didn't mean to hurt you. He was trying to help, but he made a mistake. He let his own fears get in the way." Amira's brow furrowed as she absorbed his words. "But Baba, I was scared. I needed my Epipen, and he took it away." Yusuf felt a pang of sadness as he saw the hurt in her eyes. "I know, Habibti," he said softly, using the affectionate term that meant "my beloved" in Arabic. "And what he did was wrong, but he's learning from it. He's trying to understand, so he doesn't make the same mistake again. Sometimes people need a second chance to see things more clearly." Amira was silent, her gaze thoughtful. She looked down at her hands, her small fingers tracing patterns on her jeans. "So, he was scared too?" "Yes," Yusuf replied, his voice gentle. "He was scared, just like you were. But fear doesn't make us bad people, Amira. It's what we do with that fear that matters." She nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "I want people to understand, Baba. I want them to know that just because they can't see something doesn't mean it's not real." Yusuf smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "And they will, Habibti. People like you will help them understand. You have a voice, and you're brave enough to use it." As they left the hospital, Yusuf felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had found peace with Malik, but, more importantly, he had found a way to help his daughter navigate a world that didn't always understand her. Together, they would continue to share her story, to educate and inspire others. This wasn't just a fight for Amira. It was a fight for every child, every person who lived with an invisible struggle. That evening, as the sun set, Yusuf and Amira sat together in the living room, surrounded by family, laughter, and love. They were stronger now, not because the world had changed, but because they had learned to face it together, with resilience, compassion, and a determination to make it better. In the months that followed, Yusuf's quiet resolve began to ripple through his community. Stories about Amira's experience sparked important conversations, and Yusuf became a spokesperson for change within the police force. He was determined to create a system where officers wouldn't simply act out of instinct and fear, but rather with an understanding of the invisible conditions that some people carried. His initiative gained momentum, and with support from both community leaders and families, he introduced training programs for police officers, covering topics such as medical awareness and sensitivity to hidden disabilities. Amira, too, was adjusting to life with renewed courage. Although the incident had left scars, both emotional and physical, she was learning to wear them as symbols of her strength. She still loved the park, the scent of flowers, the feel of the sun on her face, and the laughter of her friends. But now, she moved through life with a newfound awareness, an understanding that while the world could sometimes be harsh, she had the strength to face it. One afternoon, Yusuf brought her to the police station for a small ceremony, where officers who had completed the new training program were being recognized. Amira looked around, seeing faces that were both familiar and new. Some officers smiled at her, their expressions warm and encouraging. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging here, a reassurance that people were working to make the world safer for children like her. Yusuf introduced her to the gathered officers, his voice filled with pride. "This is my daughter, Amira," he said, his eyes soft as he looked at her. "She's the reason we're all here today, the reason we're learning to see the world through new eyes. Her courage has inspired us to do better, to be better." The officers clapped, and Amira felt a surge of pride and gratitude. She looked up at her father, her eyes shining with appreciation. He had taken her pain and turned it into something powerful, something that would help others. In that moment, she felt a deep sense of purpose, a knowledge that her story mattered, that her voice had made a difference. After the ceremony, they walked home together, her hand tucked safely in his. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above. As they walked, Yusuf noticed a quiet determination in her gaze, a resilience that seemed stronger than ever. "Amira," he began gently, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You've been through so much, and yet you continue to stand tall. You've inspired so many people, including me." She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I just want people to understand, Baba. I don't want anyone else to be scared the way I was." Yusuf nodded, his heart swelling with admiration. "And they will, Habibti. Thanks to you, they're starting to see things differently. You're helping them understand that everyone has their own struggles, even if they're not always visible." As they arrived at the park, Amira hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the grass. She looked around, taking in the familiar sights and sounds, the children laughing on the swings, the smell of popcorn from a nearby vendor, the vibrant flowers in bloom. This place, once filled with fear, now felt like a place of healing, a symbol of her strength. "Let's go sit under the tree," she said, pointing to the large cherry blossom tree where she and Layla had played so many times before. They settled beneath the tree, and, for a while, they simply sat in silence, enjoying the peace of the moment. Amira leaned against her father, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steady beat of his heart. She knew that life wouldn't always be easy, that her allergy would continue to shape her experiences. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, that her father and her family would always be there to support her. As they sat together, she looked around at the other children, some of whom she recognized from school. A few of them waved, and she waved back, a smile spreading across her face. She felt a sense of belonging, a realization that despite her unique challenges, She was part of a larger community, a world that was learning to understand and accept her. "Baba," she said softly, "do you think things will change? Do you think people will really start to see things differently?" Yusuf looked down at her, his gaze filled with warmth and assurance. "Yes, Amira, change takes time, but every small step counts. Your story, your courage, it's already making a difference. And one day, there will be a world where people understand, where compassion comes first." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, watching the world around them, feeling the gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers. It was a moment of peace, a quiet promise that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow, they rose to leave. Amira looked back at the park one last time, her heart filled with hope and gratitude. She knew that this place would always hold a special meaning for her, a reminder of her strength and resilience, a symbol of the journey she had taken with her father by her side. When they returned home, Amira felt a sense of completeness, a peace that came from knowing she was part of something greater than herself. Her experiences had taught her the value of empathy, of standing up for others, and she knew that she would carry these lessons with her for the rest of her life. Yusuf watched her with quiet pride, his heart filled with love and admiration for his brave daughter. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be more challenges, more battles to fight. But he also knew that together they could face anything, that they had the strength to create a world filled with understanding, compassion, and hope. And as they looked to the future, father and daughter, bound by love and resilience, they knew that they would continue to walk this path together, each step a testament to their courage, their hope, and their unbreakable bond. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Watch the following videos, share your thoughts, and tell us where you're watching from.